Today we're diving into some of history's most distasteful relationships. From royal cousin weddings to teenage brides, once you go down this rabbit hole, you're gonna need therapy. Welcome back to Into the Rabbit's Hole with me, Macabre Brie, or whatever you want to call me, Brie is fine. So today we are diving into a really gross subject. It's about creeps throughout history, particularly those who sought out companions that were much younger than them, teenagers, children, and a lot of these were within the family, let's say, so it adds another level of creepiness and degeneracy that is just... Why was that accepted? I have no explanation for that, but let's just go into some examples from way back when. Let's start with ancient Greece. They had this thing called pederasty, which, to be frank, is the relationship between a grown man and a pubescent boy. Very disturbing that there's an entire concept for that it was just accepted, but here we are. So some scholars argue that it was all very intellectual and philosophical, that they were just discussing the nature of beauty and truth and life, and other things. Some specific examples include Plato. You've all heard of Plato, right? Plato's relationship with his younger male students has been the subject of much debate. While pederasty was recognized practice in ancient Greece, the exact nature of Plato's relationships is unclear, I'm sure, because even if it was accepted, I don't think that's something that's going to be written down explicitly. Having known a little bit about, ancient Greek and Roman history, it's widely understood that there was some relationships going on the reg. And then we've got Socrates. Similar to Plato, Socrates' relationships with young men have been the subject of controversy. He was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, and some interpretations of this charge suggest it referred to pederastic relationships. Again, the evidence is ambiguous, but if you read between the lines, it's kind of obvious what was going on. And then in ancient Macedonia, the great Alexander the Great, his sexuality was the topic of much speculation, and though he had wives, he also had close relationships with a number of young male companions, most notably Hephaestion. However, again, the evidence is limited, and history has a tendency to romance any speculated queer relationships, so we don't really know for sure what happened, but it's definitely a possibility that he was engaging in some of those pederastic relationships. And then, not to forget the ladies, Sappho of ancient Greece was a female poet from Lesbos, known for her poems about love and desire, often addressed to other women. And while Sappho's work suggests strong emotional and possibly physical connections between women, the exact nature of these relationships is debated. We don't know for sure, it's just read between the lines there. And then moving over to ancient Rome, we have Claudius, who married his niece Agrippina, which, although not technically predatory, still gross. And then meanwhile, we have Caligula, who was just absolutely known for his excesses in the bedroom realm. He had some close relationships with family members, if you catch my drift. Basically, the Romans treated family boundaries like suggestions, and overall, the ancient world was a weird place. Not everybody was but it was certainly commonplace if we are to believe the inferences of what we know about that history. And even though their social norms were different, it doesn't excuse the exploitation of children. There, I said it. Moving east, we've got the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman sultans were known for their harems full of very young women. Girls, often taken from all over their empire. And these young women were often groomed to be concubines or wives in elaborate palace rituals, just kind of making it even creepier. The Renaissance, an era that gave us beautiful art and humanism, and a lot of artists that didn't understand the concept of age appropriate. Let's look at Pietro Aretino, a 16th century satirist and poet. He had a reputation for writing playful poetry about his romantic pursuits, some of which involved very young muses, and he wasn't the only one. Many poets and artists and painters of the era were obsessed with youthful beauty, with some of them leaving behind questionable portraits of their beloveds. Now, royalty. I think we're all familiar with the concept of inbreeding and royalty and how they often went for the youngins, just to keep the bloodlines pure. We've got King Henry VIII of England, was famous for his many wives, many of whom were quite young. We have King Louis the 14th of France, had a string of mistresses, some of whom were teenagers. And then Tsar Nicholas I of Russia married a 17-year-old. And then, of course, we've got numerous Egyptian pharaohs, also notorious for marrying their young cousins. And not necessarily marrying children in this instance, but we've got Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, first cousins. They had 9 kids and a family tree that was more like a wreath. It worked so well that half of Europe followed suit and married their cousins. What could go wrong with that? And let's not forget King Charles II of Spain, the product of so much inbreeding that he could barely speak and suffered from chronic illnesses his entire life. He was so genetically compromised that historians have described him as a walking case study in what not to do with a family tree. Moving forward in history, we've got, unfortunately, one of my all-time favorite authors and poets, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. Now, while he was an absolute literary genius, he married his 13-year-old cousin Virginia Clem. 13. And this was allowed for some reason. She presented herself as 21 at the marriage ceremony because if she were 13, she would have needed her father's approval, which he was dead, so she could not get it. I guess he was just really into the telltale heart of a minor because he was obsessed with her, and the loss of her eventually is what caused his descent into alcoholism and eventually death. Seriously, what the f***, Edgar? And then we've got the American West, where life was tough, and apparently so were the courtship standards, because we have Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, married several teenage girls, and it was all part of his spiritual mission. Whether or not his young brides agreed to that mission, it's another story. Throughout the American West, small frontier towns, it was not uncommon for men to marry girls as young as 12 or 13. This is so depressing. And then going back to Victorian England, but not talking about the royals in this instance, everything was really about propriety and appearances, on the surface at least. Victorian gentlemen often pursued women. I'm not going to call them women. They often pursued girls as young as 13 or 14 because that was considered marriageable age. Into the ye old 1900s, we've got Picasso, and while he is a celebrated modern-ish artist, he was apparently kind of a piece of shit. He had numerous relationships with much younger women, some of whom were actually teenagers. Hello, Bean. I know, I can't believe it either. It's ridiculous. Not gonna forget that, Picasso. And of course, we've got Hollywood, which is the place where go to thrive, it seems. Going all the way back to silent movie days, Charlie Chaplin was a bona fide creep because he knocked up a 15-year-old and then married her. So, it's very cool of him. Errol Flynn was also accused by a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old of having relations of the statutorily disallowed kind. He was ultimately acquitted, so it's all alleged, but his nickname remains of N like Flynn. And then the Hollywood poster boy of being a piece of shit, which I don't know why people still celebrate his works. Roman Polanski pleaded guilty to unlawful sex with a minor of the age of 13, and he has lived in exile ever since. And keeping in that train of famous Hollywood directors that I don't understand why anyone still celebrates them, we've got Woody Allen, who, amongst numerous allegations against him that I'm not going to get into because he married his former partner's adopted daughter, and apparently that relationship began when she was quite young. So if you can still stomach his films without cringing or thinking of what a disgusting person he is, then more power to you, because I cannot. Then, of course, we've got modern rock and roll of the 60s and 70s. I'm going to start with the so-called king of rock and roll, who actually and famously groomed a teenager to be marriageable material. And while it is reported that, nothing happened before she was of age, and creepy, okay? Elvis is obviously who I'm talking about. I know people say that's just how it was back then, but I don't think it excuses it at all. We've got Jerry Lee Lewis.
Goodness and gracious, great balls of fire!
Who married his 13-year-old cousin. That is so recent. You can't say that that was just like normal for the time. She was 13. I don't think anybody can argue that 13 is anywhere near an adult. That happened. People let it happen. People still celebrate Jerry Lee Lewis. Gross. And then we've got Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin fame and David Bowie, both accused of having a relationship with 14-year-old Lori Maddox, part of the infamous LA baby groupie scene. And there are apparently lots of these very young groupies that were connected to these rock stars and entertainers, including Mick Jagger, who fathered a child with 17-year-old Marsha Hunt, though in some countries at the time this was not considered unusual. She was still 17. And then we've got Steven Tyler, who allegedly legally obtained guardianship of 16-year-old Julia Holcomb so she could live with him as his girlfriend. Now, all these things are alleged, but I think that's just because these people are still living and we can't talk frankly about it for whatever reason. And why it's allowed is beyond me. I will never understand why it's just accepted as that's just how it was back then, or, and the fact that this sort of thing still happens, it's depressing. I'm not saying everyone in the past was a predator, but it's wild how normalized this stuff was and sometimes still is. It makes you wonder what other sort of messed up things were going on back then that we don't even know about, Well, this was a thoroughly disgusting, depressing, and awful exploration, but I feel like people don't talk about some of those people enough, and I wanted to say something. Yeah, I think next week I'll get into something a bit more fun, maybe something creepy. But yeah, if you want to see more from me, please like and subscribe.